Hello, and welcome to another week. Remember, the work week is a fiction. Monday doubly so. You can get rid of them if you really want to. This is Social Justice Alchemy. So, just imagine, here you are living your peaceful, happy life here in the U.S. Then in comes an alien invader that kills and enslaves, like 90% of the U.S. is wiped out through genocide, both accidental and deliberate. The aliens move in and start tearing everything apart. Everything we've built is erased, paved over with alien culture and technology. Sights, sounds, smells, everything is this alien cacophony of stink. The aliens are jerks to each other, too. They're bringing in slaves and servants who they treat like garbage. They live in squalor as bad as yours. And then the aliens go to war. Not with Canada or Mexico, but with each other. See, while they were slaughtering you and your family, and importing slaves in the servant caste, and setting up these massive estates and fiefdoms, the homeworld was ignoring them. There was no profit in screwing with them. But now they're established and have money. So, what does this war mean for you? Not a damn thing. The local aliens are genocidal slave-owning bastards. The distant aliens are genocidal slave-owning bastards. It's old money alien aristocrats trying to assert control over new money local alien aristocrats. You can try siding with one group or the other, trying to negotiate a better position, but really, what are you really going to get from slave-owning genocidal bastards? And then the war's over. Local aliens won. So they go ahead and set up a government, giving themselves power, ignoring their servants, their slaves, and you. Since they're not members of the homeworld ruling class, they congratulate themselves for being so forward-thinking. Hooray! They've replaced their old, distant alien aristocracy with a new, local alien aristocracy. So radical. /sarcasm. Now, some of you, a lot of you, have probably already realized what I'm going for here. The U.S. Revolution was not radical or progressive. It was liberal, in that it set up this individualist, pro-capitalist, so-called pseudo-democracy. It confirmed the authority of the landed aristocracy that settled itself in the colonies. It gave power only to wealthy white men, ignoring women, people of color, natives, slaves, and the poor. I mean, the reason the Three-Fifths Compromise was acceptable is because the northern nobility were already voting and ruling on behalf of their disenfranchised servants. The reason the northern aristocracy objected to the southern aristocracy being able to vote on behalf of their slaves is because slaves were a lot cheaper than servants, meaning that they could have a lot more slaves. That's it. So the reason they came up with the compromise, that's what they worked out, a slave cost versus what a servant cost. Now, the Patriots didn't call themselves aristocrats. They pretended to meritocracy just like wealthy people do today, that they had earned the wealth. They replaced a feudal aristocracy with a capitalist aristocracy. Revolutions always come back around to where they started. Don't trust them. And don't think of the U.S. as something new, something different, something great. It was a modification of the old to put power into the same hands. That's all. It then set about establishing the exact same kind of evil empire it had just left. Or in the words of Terry Pratchett, Awe duki noi, similis duki seneki. Here comes the new boss, same as the old boss. The U.S. has never been particularly liberal. It has never been radical or progressive. It has never been great. It's been more of the same. We really need to fundamentally alter the way the United States is set up if we want to see genuine progress, genuine human rights, genuine support for human rights, a genuinely benevolent system of government. Let's move on to the stories. Now, before we move on to the stories, I would like to talk about The Witcher. You might recall I gave a brief review of that several weeks back, early on in the podcast. I had just started the game. Well, now I have beaten the game. I like it. It is not as social justice-y as I had hoped. That one character was really the only character of that night, of that bent. There was like one side quest that basically had a gay character in there, an NPC. That was it. Everything else is really standard, although you do get to play around and hint at some characters being bisexual. There's really not a whole lot there. It is very much a standard medieval European fantasy setting, and they don't push the envelope when it comes to social justice issues. They also really don't push it in terms of lefty content either, but they didn't even hint at that, so not too surprising there. They do play around with the meta-narrative a little bit. One character is, more important than another sort of thing, and the way you're supposed to play, don't assume that, that you should be playing this like a typical role-playing narrative, things like that. It's very clever and I think fairly well done in terms of trying to get the best ending, the happiest ending sort of thing. So I really do enjoy the gameplay. I like exploring open worlds, things like that. It's nothing too revolutionary in terms of mechanics either. I give it a good recommend, but it's more cheeseburger than steak dinner. Alright, let's move on to the stories now. Our first story comes from lawandcrime.com, an opinion piece written by Elura Nanos. DeVos just pulled a full Marie Antoinette and retracted fraud rules against for-profit colleges. Now, I'm an educator working at the college level, and this fucking infuriates me. I mean, occasionally I go to apply to a place. I always check to see what kind of place that I'm looking at. Is it, an actual educational institution, or is it a for-profit scam? And I always avoid the for-profit scams, because I'm a decent person. But Betsy DeVos just said, nah, those places, they're good people. They need to not be facing any sort of oversight. She retracted the gainful employment rule that is supposed to protect students from these predatory institutions that use false advertising to give students worthless degrees and saddle them with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Namely, students have to be able to get actual jobs using the diploma and institution grants, or it's going to get spanked by the federal government. Well, that rule was passed under the Obama administration, so naturally the Trump administration has been looking to get rid of it, and DeVos finally just did that. And of course she did so with a whole bunch of Orwellian doublespeak about how this is actually going to protect students. Well, no, it's not. It just allows these institutions to go in and lie. We're talking about, god damn, all sorts of awful, shitty schools like Virginia College and Trump University. Places that just suck up tons and tons of money and give you nothing of value in return. The free market does not protect against fraud. It never has. Only government regulation has done that. Betsy DeVos is just there to make sure that the rich get richer and the poor get fucked. And this shit makes me furious. God. Well, that's a good way to start. Let's go ahead and move on to our next story, why don't we? Our next story involves the war in Yemen, or the more accurately called ongoing genocide in Yemen. Now, as you may or may not be aware, the Saudi government has been leading a coalition of forces, not just their own forces, but also UK forces and US forces, and mercenaries, formerly called Blackwater. You might recall them from Iraq. Well, this has been happening since 2015. Wikipedia calls it an intervention. I'm calling it an ongoing genocide because they're committing all sorts of war crimes, and they've been blockading the place. There's been a massive cholera outbreak causing tens of thousands of deaths, and we're talking about starvation. This is not a good situation. The reason I'm bringing it up this week is because 40 Yemeni children were killed by a US-made bomb. The Saudis used British intelligence to target a bomb made by the US that killed a couple dozen Yemeni children. I found out about this thanks to the Feringula blog, written by P.Z. Myers. He quoted another article saying this is just the latest string of really brutal attacks on civilians in Yemen. It's not the worst of its kind in terms of the number of people killed, but certainly because 40 of the 51 were children, it really is just an extreme form of this Saudi-led coalition bombing in Yemen. I mean, the children were on a school trip, and now they're dead. And PZ, Dr. Myers, has pointed out that it's really, really easy for people to justify this sort of thing. How? Well, he quotes an AP reporter saying, "What is very hard to determine in Yemen is what the children were doing. We worked on covering Yemen since 2015. We know that the Saudi-led coalition has bombed civilian targets all the time. Markets, hospitals, schools. This is not a surprise. But we also know that the Houthis, those are rebels, are actively recruiting the children, and then they send them to the front line. And the question marks here that are not answered yet is, what were the children doing at the time? In other words, the children might have been up to something, therefore it's okay that 40 children are dead." Or, to quote PZ himself, "Dude, I'm having flashbacks, man. I grew up during the Vietnam War. I was too young to go, fortunately, but this stuff was in the news all the time. And I remember all the rationalizations for dropping napalm on villages. This is the same old story. We don't know exactly what these kids were doing, but we can imagine all kinds of nefarious schemes, so let's pretend after the fact that they were all evil terrorists in training. It's all too familiar." Fortunately, a Yemeni scholar was able to reply and said, "To just quickly respond to what your guest just said, it doesn't really matter what the children were doing. They were children. They were in summer school, and for the Saudi-led coalition to bomb a bus full of children is a war crime, regardless of what the children were doing." The Saudi government has had the full support of the United States for decades. And right now, they're at war shoring up their own little empire there in the Middle East, and they have our support in that as well. They're committing war crimes, they're committing genocide, and we are culpable. We need to do better. We need to fix this god-awful situation. This is not a good week for news. But then, it never is when you have multiple evil empires working on securing control of the world. Let's move on. Now, our next story comes to us through the British Psychological Society's Research Digest. Title, "Brainwave Study Suggests Sexual Posing, but Not Bare Skin, Leads to Automatic Objectification," by one Alex Fredera. The study attempts to discover when people are sexually objectified. Now, there is a response known as N170, which is just an event-related potential, it's called. Basically, when you're measuring brain waves, you see N170 when people recognize faces, when they see human beings. And when they look at other things, say even animal faces or objects, or, and this is important, inverted human faces, pictures of human beings upside down, they don't get that same response. So this is a good measure of when people are seeing another person versus when they see something that the brain is not categorizing as a person. Now, I looked for the actual article, and it's behind a paywall, and I don't really want to pay $36 to get access to a single article, but I have the abstract here. And it says, "Recent research found that sexualized bodies are visually processed similarly to objects." This article examines the effects of skin-to-clothing ratio and posture suggestiveness on cognitive objectification. Participants were presented images of upright versus inverted bodies while we recorded the N170. We used the N170 amplitude inversion effect, larger N170 amplitudes for inverted versus upright stimuli, to assess cognitive objectification, with no N170 inversion effect indicating less configural processing and more cognitive objectification. Contrary to Hypothesis 1, skin-to-clothing ratio was not associated with cognitive objectification. That is to say, they showed people pictures of people scantily clad versus fully clothed. And the result was there was no increase in objectification just because you saw more skin. However, consistent with Hypothesis 2, we found that posture suggestiveness was the key driver of cognitive objectification, even after controlling for body asymmetry, meaning they put people in suggestive poses, hand near their groin, hand behind their head, showing off the goods. But in order to control for the fact that the bodies were now asymmetrical, they also presented them in other asymmetrical but not suggestive poses. This article showed that high versus low posture suggestiveness caused cognitive objectification, regardless of body asymmetry, whereas high versus low skin-to-clothing ratio did not. The implications for objectification and body perception literatures are discussed. Now, like I said, I don't have access to the full article, but this is interesting. It shows that there is a huge cultural component to this, right? Well, maybe. I don't know. I mean, maybe posture, suggestiveness, and so on is kind of universal. I really don't know. What I do know is that telling people to cover up doesn't do it. Once again, the prudes have it wrong. It's a volitional act that makes this, that makes something suggestive, and it's part of communication between people. I'm taking that pretty much directly out of the main article from the Digest. As Alex Federa put it, as far as I see it, suggestive posturing is a volitional act, I'm quoting here, that we make in the moment, one that is intended to express, quote, see what's on offer, unquote. That people respond to such invitations by checking out the wares rather than the person seems to me to reflect the response working as intended. In contrast, skin exposure need not be any kind of signal to a viewer. We expose skin when we wash, swim, or stay cool, or just because we want to. That seeing skin can rouse some sexual feeling, but doesn't automatically make us see the person any less, seems to me to be a fairly decent and respectful way for our perceptual and cognitive architecture to be put together. I think that is a pretty awesome response. I don't know who this Alex Federa individual is, a staff writer at BPS Research Digest, but I don't know much beyond that. And that is, I think, an excellent takeaway. Also an excellent takeaway is the next paragraph of Federa's article. I should leaven this optimistic take by recognizing that these actions take place in a cultural context. In the hunt for ways to titillate and capture attention, media and advertising have exploited the sexual and objectifying qualities of the provocative pose in a way that inundates and threatens to normalize this way of viewing. Now that is also excellent. And I recall, it's been quite some time, but once upon a time, advertising for underwear, for women's underwear, was not provocative in the way it is now. It was from like the early 20th century and showed, of all things, a woman in a corset, but it just showed her standing there. It wasn't like Victoria's Secret advertising today, where they're practically fucking. Very, very different. So yes, advertising has definitely taken advantage of the suggestive pose. But is the suggestive pose universal, or is it individual to the culture? I really don't know. I'd be interested to find out. What we do know, at the very least, is that objectification is not necessarily an automatic prospect. And laws that regulate how much skin you can show, or rules in classrooms, for example, are bullshit. And the prudes need to shut the fuck up. It's not about what she was wearing. It was about what, generally speaking, he wanted, rather than what she was doing. Alright, let's move on. Alright, our next story is actually a pair of stories. I wanted to compare the response that I've seen, generally speaking. Now, somebody in one of my social media feeds has been sharing stuff from Franklin Graham. Franklin Graham is the son of now deceased Billy Graham, an evangelical piece of shit, anti-Semite racist motherfucker. And Franklin Graham seems to be following in Daddy's footsteps because he is sharing over and over and over again Fox News stories, I should say, about 5 Muslims, 2 men and 3 women, who were allegedly keeping 11 starving children in a New Mexico compound surrounded by weapons. Apparently, according to Fox News, training them for school shootings. Fox News has been reporting on this all over the place. In fact, I had to work pretty hard to find some place that was reporting on this that wasn't Fox News. But this has been a huge response, despite the fact that it was a handful of people. Compare this to another story out of the Daily Beast. Catholic Church shielded priests who raped boys, but it helped lock up a priest who swiped bucks. We have seen over and over again, everywhere you look in the Catholic Church, Boston, Pennsylvania, Italy, Ireland, it doesn't really matter. The Catholic Church has been, for centuries, an organization that was absolutely horrifically abusive to the people under its power, under its control. And the response from the Fox News viewers has been apathy at best, if not just outright support for the Catholic Church. Why are people doing this now? Why didn't they come forward earlier? Why didn't they excuse after excuse after excuse the same old victim-blaming bullshit in support of what I think should be called an international terrorist organization at this point, given how many lives it's destroyed? And yet you have this small New Mexico compound where the people have already been caught and they're being charged, and the Fox News Brigade can't shut the fuck up about it. The far right is concerned about supporting those who already have power, regardless of the harm they cause. The left is about supporting people who have no power in order to prevent them coming to harm. That is the big difference between right and left. Support for authority versus support for people being harmed. It is important to remember that, important to keep that in mind going forward, and important to come up with ways to respond to motherfuckers who want to bring up shit like the New Mexico compound when you're talking about something like the Catholic Church. Because they almost certainly will. I think a good response is, yeah, that's bad. This is also bad. Stop changing the subject. Fucker. Yep, let's go ahead and move on. This time to the evils of the Trump administration. This next story is a very important reminder. It comes to us from commondreams.org. I really think that the title says it all. As corporate media has moved on, just a reminder that 565 children are still separated from families due to Trump's monstrous policies. Quote, interest in the Omarosa story far exceeds interest in the child separation story. This week, despite hundreds of kids still in limbo, child separation barely registers. This is by Jay Johnson, who's a staff writer there at Common Dreams. You almost don't even need to read the article. That headline, it's a paragraph of a headline, so it really does say everything it needs to. These children have been held in concentration camps for months now. It's easy to forget things like this during the god-awful chaos and shitstorm that is the Trump presidency. But it's important not to let this sort of thing fall through the cracks and be forgotten. We need to remember these children. We need to fight for these children. These children need to remain front and center moving into November. The fact that this policy was ever enacted is, in my opinion, an act of genocide. Stealing children from vulnerable people. It might just be a war crime, not an act of genocide. Technically, legally, I don't give a shit. It's a monstrous act. It should never have happened. And we cannot allow anyone to forget it. We should never allow anyone to get over it. The responsible people need to be held responsible in a long-term and definitive fashion. I will be very upset if anyone from this administration gets to walk away unscathed. They've committed atrocities. We must never forget. So, let's ignore my typical phrase. Let's not move on. Let's continue. Now, I caught wind of our next story while I was perusing BBC. Trump has finally canceled his fucking piece of shit military parade. Thank goodness for that, yeah? Unfortunately, he did so for the wrong reason. Instead of canceling it because military parades are the thing that dictators do, he canceled it because of costs. Namely, it turns out that the absurdly low price tag of $10 to $30 million, how low? How ridiculously low? How many people could you feed for $10 to $30 million? Well, it turns out that it was going to cost more like $90 million, so he gave up on that, and of course he blamed politicians there in D.C. You know, the local politicians, the people who serve the actual long-term population of D.C., that is to say, who serve the brown people who live there. Now, obviously, it's almost certainly clear I despise this administration and everything it does, because it is a fascist organization, because it is trying to harm the most vulnerable among us. But I also hate things like this. This is not mere symbolism. The fascist base loves this sort of shit. Okay, that's why Hitler did that sort of shit all the time. That's why Mussolini did that shit. That's why the Soviets did that. That's why they do this sort of thing. Because it really gets the fascists fired up. If they ever actually manage to getting around to putting on this fascistic military display, then I don't doubt there will be a surge in violence and hate crimes throughout the United States that very night. If it were anywhere other than D.C., I would expect violent right-wing riots. I really, really hope they never, ever get to do this. I'm hoping that the blue wave includes enough adamant opponents and not just traditional Democrats that they can prevent this sort of shit from happening. I don't know how they would, but I hope they can. I hope we can hamstring this motherfucker and his pretensions toward dictatorship. So this is kind of a piece of good news, but there is some really good news waiting just around the corner. Y'all ready for this? Now, before we head into this last story, our happy news, I want to stress that I'm aware that the government of India has a lot of problems. I am not a fan, generally speaking. I covered just recently that they were looking to de-citizenize, depersonize, depopulate, dehumanize, quite literally, millions of people. But, that said, the nation of India is looking to expand their healthcare system. They are introducing free healthcare for 500 million people. Remember, more than 1 billion people live in the nation of India, so we're talking about more than a third of their population will now be getting expanded healthcare. The National Healthcare Protection Mission, known as Modicare, will give, I'm quoting directly from the Newsweek article, impoverished families health insurance coverage of up to $7,100 every year. Now, that's not a lot in U.S. dollars, but the annual per capita income of India is $1,900. So that $7,100 will cover quite a bit. And 70% of healthcare costs there in India are paid directly by the patients, and it drives millions of people into poverty every year. So this is pretty fucking awesome. India is one of the up-and-coming economies. It's one of the BRIC economies, B-R-I-C, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So this is pretty fucking awesome. And if India can do this with a healthcare system that is stretched to the breaking point, then obviously the United States can do this with a far smaller population and with far much more money available. This is a big deal. And hopefully, by easing the burden on hundreds of millions of people in India, it will push India away from some of its fascistic policies. I'm hoping that this will make things a hell of a lot better for a hell of a lot of people there in India, and maybe shift global politics a little bit to the left. I don't know if it actually will. But here's hoping, because I think that is some big, good news. And that just about wraps it up for another week of Social Justice Alchemy. I'd like to thank you for listening. I've been your alchemist, John Brockman. If you like the podcast, then maybe you'd like to hear a little bit more of me. I also have a YouTube channel. Right now, it's just the podcast in YouTube video form. But starting in September, I will be doing a sort of book club. I tracked down a nice copy of Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread, in English. I'm not that fancy. And I'll be going through that chapter by chapter, week by week, starting in September. So, you can catch me there, the Social Justice Alchemy YouTube channel. You can also find me in another podcast. It's a little bit lighter than this one. It's my friend Kevin hosting a group of us as we run through a D&D campaign. It's dungeonsandDebacles.podcast.com as we seek to right an ancient wrong and unleash an ancient evil that will destroy the world, possibly. All right. And if you've liked this, if you like the idea of what I'm doing, please go ahead and give me positive reviews, thumbs up, things like that. Maybe like, share, subscribe. And if you have any responses you'd like to give, you can go ahead and leave those at the YouTube channel or at my blog, surgoshan.blogspot.com. That's surgoshan.blogspot.com. Regardless, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.